Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Rosa Technocrat. Today we are going to discuss about URL access policy on Fortiweb. Let's start. So how this topic came into my mind is recently I had an issue where one of my business unit requirement or one of my customer requirement was to block some specific URL from public while providing them access from the VPN users. And same way around, he had to access some URLs or applications from public IPs while restricting them access from the internal network because internal network was going to a different host name while public IPs needs to go to a different host name. So this requirement prompted me to create a video about URL access policy on Fortiweb. So we will be discussing what is URL access policy, how we can configure it, how we can check, troubleshoot, and all. And I will also be demonstrating this by doing a configuration and then verifying how it works. Okay, let's start. So we will be talking about what is URL access policy. If you see here, let me quickly take a pen. So we will be talking about what is URL access policy, that we create this part. What is a URL access rule? URL access parameters, how to configure it, what are the different use cases for URL access, and how to figure out if your URL access is working properly, and the troubleshooting for URL access policy. So, what URL access policy does? So, URL access policy has got some matching criterias, and you have to define a condition for the matching criteria. And if the criteria matches, then Fortiweb allows or denies the access to that URL or drops to that URL or hostname application while restricting uh, access from other conditions or other matching conditions. So what are the different matching criteria that we can do? So we can match condition with the URL pattern. For example, specific URLs or wildcard patterns can be defined. So for example, if the URL contains a slash admin, then do this. For example, let's say if I have a website called rosa.ae, okay, and slash admin. So I can say if the website contains slash admin, only allow this from specific IP, okay, only allow from this specific IP and deny for all others. This is one condition. So this is a matching condition one. So if the hostname is rosa.ae and the URL pattern is slash admin and specific source IP, then allow them access. Okay. And if apart from this IP address, if any other IP is coming, then you deny the access. So this can be one of the matching conditions. So we said URL patterns, source IP, HTTP methods, and protocol. These four checks can be done on the Fortiweb when you are defining the criteria or matching conditions for URL access policy. So, what are the different use cases of URL access policy? So, as we discussed, restricting access to admin pages. So, your application might be having various different URLs or different pages, but you want to restrict the admin pages, or you don't want to allow slash admin, or some pages should not be allowed to the public. So that can be one of the case where you can use URL access policy. Same way, you might have many various sensitive URLs which should not be allowed. So that is protecting sensitive URLs, and then preventing specific URL access with certain parts of the category. So these are like various use case examples for URL access policy on Fortiweb. So how do we configure it? Okay. So how do we configure URL access rule and policy? So When we are configuring an URL access rule, the Fortiweb has got all these available options as part of the configuration available. So you have got the name, host status, host action, severity, trigger policy. So name is simply a like name for the rule. Okay, what is the name of the access rule? So that is name. Host status is if you want to verify the host. Okay, so verify the host means, as I gave an example, like my website or my host name is Rosa. Okay, Techie, Rosa Techie, Rosa Techie .ae. So I can turn on the host and I can say if the request matches this particular host name, then what action has to be taken. So that action is, it can be either pass, that means allow it, alert and deny, that means deny it and present him with a message that you are denied. Deny him but no log, that means just deny him, he will not come to know anything. So it will be basically like a send reset packet sent to the user. And then continue means no further inspection will be done and we trust them. No more web protection profile or any other security checks will be checked for that, and it will be simply allow. But in case of pass, it is like URL access rule is passed, but it has to go through the other security inspection checks on the Fortiweb. But in case of continue, it is like just continue inspecting any further web protection rule. And pass is allow it without any further checks. I'm sorry, before that I just said opposite. So pass is allow the URL without any further checks and without generating logs. While continue is allow the URL while continue inspecting any further web protection profile. Deny the request without any logs, generate logs and deny the request. So these are the like different options available under the URL access rule. So once we define these things, these parameters, name, host, status, so once these are like defined, we will click on create new, and under create new, we have to create a URL access condition. So what will be that URL access condition? URL access condition will define what type of URL type you are defining, whether it is a simple string or you can also use a regular expression to define your URL pattern that to be blocked or allowed. If you want to verify some parameters within the URL, that can also be checked. And if you want to do a get request or post request or put request, if you want to verify the method, HTTP method for the URL or HTTP request, this can also be verified. And then we have to select meet this condition. So either it can be like meet or does not meet. You can select one of these category, whether you want to ignore this pattern or you want to accept this pattern. So once you click this OK, then your pattern will be defined. Here is an example. For example, I did a URL type simple string, and URL pattern is I am saying slash vulnerability slash brute force. That is my pattern. And I say object matches the source and the URL pattern. That means if the source IP is this IP and he's trying to access slash brute force, then I'm going to, what I'm going to do, I am going to deny him. Okay, so the action defined is here while the matching conditions are defined here. So if I want to read this simply, or so I will say if my client from IP address dash 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 dot 60 is trying to access slash vulnerability slash brute, then alert and deny him. Okay, so that is my URL access rule. So then this URL access rule will be bound to URL access policy, and URL access policy needs to be bound to web protection profile. So you can't only configure the URL access policy, but you have to bind this URL access policies to web protection profile. Okay, so now let's start our lab time where we will be doing all this as always. Let's go. I will access my URL lab. Let's go. Okay, so here I am on my Fortiweb. So the URL access policy is available under web protection and URL. So once you click on URL access policy, you will see a URL access policy needs to be created. So to create a policy, you simply have to like define a new URL policy. I can say Rosa access policy lab 2, or I'm doing it right now. So first we have to define a URL policy access name, and then we have to match the conditions. What are the conditions? That means URL access rule, you have to bind it under the URL access policy. So all the URL access rules that are already created will be listed as part of the list, or you can click on create and create a new rule. So I can say uh, for uh, I can say lab 2 access rule 1, for, just for as an example. And for now I don't have a host name for my application. I am just using it via a, um, via an IP address. So I will not check for the host name. Okay, then you have to say alert and deny or whatever the action you want, and then you have to click on OK. Sorry. So once you define this access rule, lab to access rule 1, and I say alert and deny, I created this access rule. Okay. Now under this access rule, you have to match the condition. So what condition you have to match is here, like what is the URL type and what you want to do. So slash brute I want to match, or slash vulnerabilities slash brute. Okay. So this you have to match slash, this is the path, URL pattern path, and I will click object matches the pattern, object matches the URL pattern. So this is my condition. So if the client is accessing slash vulnerability slash brute, then action will be alert and deny. Okay, so I have already created this. I will just cancel these ones. Okay, once the URL access policy is created, you have to go to web protection profile, sorry, under policy, your server policy. So you will be having a server policy for your application. In my case, I have this server policy. This server policy is binded to a web protection profile, or I can say web protection profile is binded to the server policy. So let's go to the web protection profile. So when you click on web protection profile, I have my this web protection profile. So under the web protection profile, you will see URL access policy, or the URL access policy that you need to bind. So you see here access, under access you have URL access. So that URL access what you created there under web protection, you have to call it here. So both the all the URL access policies that you had created will be listed. So you have to select the URL access policy, click OK. So once this URL access policy is binded to the web protection profile, and web protection profile binded to your server policy, that means now that action is applied to your server policy. So as you can see, my application is having an VIP. This VIP I will try to access from the client. So you can see 10.66.66.11. You can see here I'm trying to access slash vulnerability slash brute. So when I try to access, it says 10.66 vulnerability, the page cannot be displayed and web page is blocked. But why we are getting this message, right? So from this message we are able to see it is blocked by Fortiweb, right? So this is because of our action. If we go, okay, now how to verify? If we go to log and report, log access and attack, under attack you should be able to get a log for our action. So you can see here, you can see I tried to access from this particular source and my destination was this. Okay, so what it says method get this IP address slash vulnerability slash root. What is the action? You can see action is alert and deny. And which rule it matched? It matched URL access rule, rule 2 violation. Rule 2 violation. So it is breaking the URL access rule that we created. That's why this has been logged as an attack and the access was denied because of alert and deny. Okay. Now let's check what is the difference between alert, deny, pass, continue. Okay. So go to web protection protocol, sorry, access, URL access, and I will edit my. Okay. Okay. One more thing I want to show. You can bind multiple access rules under a access policy. So what my first access rule says is, if I'm getting slash setup.php, if the client is trying to access slash setup.php, let's go, and I will try to access on my application. I will try to access setup.php, setup.php. So this is blocked. Okay. Now my second rule says, what my second rule says is, my second rule says if the application is or URL is slash vulnerability slash root and IP address is 50. So this is my IP is 50. I will try slash vulnerability slash root. So still it's blocked. That means because of my second rule is blocked. Now I want to negate this, or then I can say for this particular rule 2, I want to do it a uh, continue. Okay. So now what I am doing is I created two rules. I binded two rules here from the same client, same IP subnet. If it is accessing slash vulnerability slash root, it should be blocked. While if it is accessing slash setup.php, let's see, setup.php, I guess, vulnerability slash root, it should be accessible because we changed the action to continue. Let's go here. See, now it was blocking, but if I access the same website again, it allowed me. It allowed me because I specified the IP address. So what our case now is, application slash from the same client, everything is working. If I do setup.php, it blocks me. And if I do any other part or any other URL, all right, any other URL, then it will allow me. So this is how Fortiweb URL access policy works. So URL access policy has to be binded to the web protection profile, and web protection profile will be binded to your server policy. But make sure you define the conditions properly as per your requirement, as per access requirement. That is what is important. So understanding these access rule, how to match these conditions is important here. So you can see you can have multiple access rules all binded to a URL access policy, and then URL access policy will be called upon in the web protection profile. And whenever you want to see any logs which are denied or blocked because of a URL access rule, those will come under attack log. Because of an attack, they were logged as an attack. So once we check the logs, you can see here URL access, URL access, URL access. So you can see here, because on ROSA web server policy, if the slash vulnerability slash root was accessed and it was alert and deny, so it was denied. And if I say setup.php, then also it was deny. Okay. URL access, it is deny. So wherever it matches the condition, it will say uh, these are denied. Okay, so you can define any conditions, and this will help you in scenarios where you want to block or deny specific part of URL, specific admin access, or from VPN it should be allowed, not from this subnet. So many like scenarios it comes. I know I was into an operation earlier. Operation means on a customer side into the operations team, and I used to deal with a lot of such queries where they were like, okay, this particular application should only be accessed from so and so IP address and blah blah blah. There are hundreds of such scenarios which can be created, and which in which URL access on Fortiweb will be very useful for you guys. Hope this will help you. This is informative, and if you guys like my videos, please do subscribe to my channel. Thank you everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye bye.